Well, hello and welcome to the third conversation in our new series, What's Love Got to Do with It? I'm going to talk a little science here up front, so I thought I should get a science outfit of some sort. I couldn't find a white lab jacket, so I borrowed a painter's apron from an artist that I know. Hopefully she won't mind. We'll talk a little bit about a number of things today that I think that you'll find very, very interesting. Remember, we started off this whole thing two different conversations ago, beginning with the idea of some of the definitions of the idea of love. And remember, as I insisted then, and will continue to insist as we go along, this is also the title being What's Love Got to Do with It, but it's also a personal journey of mine, and I would hope a personal journey of yours as well. In our last conversation, the second conversation, we talked about the really big picture. We'll talk a little bit more about that today, and then we'll delve into the origins of who we actually are ourselves. We talked last time about the ultimate lover, God, perhaps ambushed from eternity by love, as it shows up and is demonstrated in the Holy Trinity, and as eventually how it is demonstrated by everything that we know and that we see. Remember our marbles from last time and how important that was, that concept that everything that exists that we can know of would have fit into this little marble at the beginning of time as we know it. This is not to say there may not be other time somewhere else. But in our universe, the whole thing started, as we saw, about 13.7.8, almost 14 billion years ago. Everything that we are, everything that we know, everything that we observe in our environment here on this little rock in the midst of the universe, in the midst of our galaxy and our solar system, everything that we know began as star stuff. We're going to need a couple of books to help us along the way today, one of which we have talked about before, and that would be Elizabeth Johnson's book on Ask the Beasts, Darwin and the God of Love. A phenomenal book, and I would recommend it to all of you. It'll be on the bibliography that I will be sending to all of you as we go along with this. The second book that I'm going to recommend to you is called Mama's Last Hug by Frans de Waal. And we'll talk a little bit about what that's all about in just a moment. But this is an absolutely wonderful book. It'll help you focus yourselves on what it means to be part of this whole magnificent structure that we find ourselves in. We're all of us, star stuff. It all began about 4 billion years ago in this particular part of the Milky Way galaxy with the explosion of a giant star and the debris left over from that explosion, a much smaller core star, as well as all the rest of the materials that were part of that big star, would gradually coalesce, come together, form into orbital structures, and yield the solar system as we know it to this very day. Now, apparently, this all happened about 4 billion years ago. It only took really about 500 million years. That sounds like, are you kidding? That's an immense number. It is an immense number, but it's not very immense when we're talking about universal time, the time of the cosmos. 500 million years is relatively short term. But from what science is able to determine, about 500 million years ago, life began on this planet. Not exactly sure how that occurred. Whether it occurred here first or whether it occurred somewhere else first and was brought here, we don't know all those answers yet. Science is hard after them and will have answers, but not at the present time. Over this period, this 3.5 billion year period since life began on this planet, everything that we know in our daily lives including ourselves, began at that time. Every particle of our bodies, all of it began at that particular time. Now, we should always keep in mind the prophetic words of Karl Rahner. Karl Rahner, fantastic and wonderful theologian, philosopher, writer, lecturer. Karl Rahner said at one time, wrote that, "Do not underestimate what it means for nature to become." Do not underestimate what it means for nature to become. And as I mentioned to you in our last conversation, Elizabeth Johnson says that the dance of law and chance over unimaginable eons of time brings forth the community of life on earth as we know it. And she adds, it's all such an adventure. Is it indeed? Is it indeed? It's all such an adventure. It's difficult, if perhaps even impossible, for us billions of years down the road to really grasp the ideas, the facts, the concepts, the scope of all that's around us. But it's true. It's all true. So what about the notion of human evolution? That's what we'll spend some time with today, the notion of human evolution. As I said, it's going to get a little bit thick scientifically, so I wore my scientist outfit today. You may already have quite a bit of this information, but it's helpful sometimes just to go back over it together again. The best evidence would suggest that following the great extinction of 65 million years ago, in large part, what we know right now and who we are dependent upon that. So 65 million years ago, an asteroid approximately, as far as science can tell us, about 6 miles wide, plowed into the Earth. It was so immense and the impact was so great, it really, had it been just a little bit larger, actually could have split the Earth up into pieces. But it didn't. Instead, it plowed into what today we see as the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, in large measure, that's why there is a Gulf of Mexico. That, in essence, is a gigantic crater where this meteor would have plowed into this about 65 million years ago. So what? Well, up until that point, the Earth was dominated through the evolutionary process by the big reptiles, the really big reptiles. We're talking, excuse me, T-Rex and all of his companions, the really big reptiles. The mammals had also evolved from the beginning point at 500 million years after the initial advent of the planet. They had also evolved along the way, but they could not compete with these giant reptiles. As a consequence, the mammals of the day were little tiny guys, scurrying about, trying to take up the space that was still available in light of the giant reptiles. With this 65 million year ago disaster, as far as the big reptiles were concerned, that expelled the extinction of these animals. Why? Well, because what that huge explosion did, it was blanketed the Earth with an immense cloud of ash, dust, and smoke that, in fact, for a very long period of time, cut out the sun. And as a consequence, the plant life and whatnot that many of these critters depended upon died. And so did the animals who depended upon those plants, as did the animals who depended upon those animals for their food. This was a boon, a great boon for those little scurrying mammals. They, in fact, then from that point on, 65 million years ago, they would, in fact, develop into all of the various mammalian and other life forms that we see today. All of this would eventually lead to a particular mammal, a particular primate, actually, in Africa. Once again, over a very long period of time, through numerous adaptations. numerous adaptations from the beginning of life and from the beginning of the mammalian life. One of the most important adaptations being an opposable thumb, which occurred millions of years ago and took probably about 1,000,000 years, according to Jacob Bronowski, about 1,000,000 years for that to develop from a flat paw to a thumb that could actually oppose. This became a part of the essential tools of the primates. But another adaptation that we may not think about immediately is the ability to walk upright. This was huge. We think, why? What was such a big deal about that? Well, prior to that, of course, animals, mammals, whatnot, were for the most part four-legged, and even the primates would tend to walk with all four on the ground. They could stand, sort of, but not consistently. What did this adaptation allow for? One of the biggest things that it would allow for, and probably how it developed, by being able to stand up and look around, these animals were able to see above the grass of the immense plains. Why might that be an advantage? Because the big predators of the time, who had evolved along with all the rest, we're talking, once again, things that will eventually be lions and whatnot, they also would have been a part of life, and they could easily go through the grasses, the tall grasses, without really being seen. If I could stand up and look over the top of the grasses, whoa, look at what I see over here. And I could make a run for it, back into the trees, whatever was necessary. What we would think to be a relatively simple adaptation turned out to be life and death. So think of those two adaptations particularly: opposable thumbs, ability to stand up and look outright. We should also remember that adaptations in the evolutionary process, they occur to take advantage of some particular aspect. And they tend to take advantage of that, and then it can become a part of the actual genetic manufacturing organisms and be passed on to future generations. As, for instance, a small, very small adaptation begins to take hold and is passed down and becomes a little bit larger and a little bit larger, that, in fact, will play a huge role in the whole process of evolution through the years, through the millennia, hundreds of thousands. With Dr. Johnson, Elizabeth Johnson, we should keep in mind what she says, that the origin of species is shot through with surprise. Shot through with surprise. It would also behoove us to recollect, and to remember, and to keep in mind that life evolves really at a terrible cost in pain and death. As Dr. Sagan had mentioned in his Cosmos series a number of years ago, evolution depends upon immense amounts of time, huge amounts of time, and death. One generation has to get out of the way so the next can continue on, bringing along with it the adaptations necessary that have been found to take advantage of some specific area. Pain, suffering, death, these are intrinsic parts of the process of evolution. We may not like that. Well, in that case, as an old friend said, too bad for you, talking to me. Yeah, that is the way that it is. And how we live with that, how we not just cope with it, but how we take that as part of our spiritual journey as well, is extremely important. Keep in mind that life evolves at a terrible cost in pain and death. And it takes place through the eons, little step by little step. One of the things Elizabeth Johnson mentioned that I thought was wonderful is that nature tinkers. Nature tinkers. A little bit here, a little bit there. Nature tinkers. In fact, I'll tell you, I almost named the series Nature Tinkers. I think it's a wonderful thing to kind of keep in mind as we go along. Now, evolutionary anthropologists will tell us that in reality, from the time that we, as a species that will eventually become what we refer to as Homo sapiens, there were probably another 20, maybe 25 other species that were also potential humanoids that went extinct along the way. For one reason or another, through all of the different processes of evolution, comings and goings, pain and death, the line that led to us right here and now survived. That's been going on for about 3.5 million years, maybe 2.5 million years, as the branch of our family, the family that would go toward hominids and eventually toward Homo sapiens, would split off from the tree of life, from the branch that went toward chimpanzees and bonobos on one side and gorillas and orangutans on the other, and the other primates. The branch that we happened to be a part of at that time would continue on over this immense period of time. We've got an interesting chart I thought you might like to see. Take a look at this. Gives you kind of a general idea of the times when these various things would have taken place. Our present species, Homo sapiens, the one that will survive, probably developed, of course, once again in the plains of Africa over a long period of time of wandering about on that huge continent as well, of course. And eventually, over the period of 300, 200,000 years, not millions, 300, 200,000 years, would lead to the one specific ancestor of ours that can actually be designated. We'll talk about that in just a moment. First of all, and this can be kind of uncomfortable for some of us, should not be, we really need to recollect that about 200, 250,000 years ago, we all lived in Africa. We all came up out of Africa. You may have read Isak Dinnison's book or even seen the film, Meryl Streep, Robert Redford, Out of Africa. In essence, we all came up out of Africa. Our ancestors were following the game trails, the other animals, whatnot. And that would take them north, east, west, southern tips of Africa. The whole planet as we know it today over a long period of time. We all started off out of Africa. That's a very interesting notion, idea, reality, when you think of, for instance, the racial tensions involved in the world at the present time. We are all, absolutely all, we are all brothers and sisters. What does that mean? Well, that's also a very fascinating piece. Science, genetic science, has been able to actually pinpoint the female primate, Homo sapiens, that is in fact the mother of us all. All of our DNA, every single human being on the planet today can trace her or his ancestry back to a female in Africa about 200, 250,000 years ago, who is referred to sometimes as the mitochondrial Eve. The mitochondrial Eve, the foundation stone, the very female from whom all of us sprang. Wow. This does not mean there were not other females, of course, at her time and also before her. But what genetic science is able to show us is that all of us came from that one female and the expansion of her line over a 200,000 year period of time. What are the changes? Why do I look the way I do and others look the way they do? That, of course, has to do with climate, environment, and all of the vicissitudes of life that play out in all of us and have over these 200,000 years. Sometimes that's difficult to appreciate or acknowledge, but it's true. It is absolutely true. We all, in fact, were dark-skinned to begin with, and we only evolved through time and environment. That's the truth. Wow. Oh, but wait, weren't we talking about love? I think that we were. Now comes the fun part. I could probably even take off my scientific paraphernalia here, and let's talk just poison to poison, as it were. The line of hominini, or hominins, as the line will lead down to us eventually, as I mentioned, separated from the chimpanzees and the bonobos. They're our closest relatives. Roughly about the same time that the two species, as I mentioned, separated from the gorillas and the orangutans and whatnot. However, as a result of this, genetic science again tells us that our genetic makeup, every human being alive today, our genetic makeup is 99 exactly the same as the genetic makeup of chimpanzees and bonobos. This has tended to bother people through the ages, but no need. That's simply the way that it is. We are extremely close to them. In fact, we are closer genetically to the chimpanzees and the bonobos than they are to the gorillas. Really? Really. This plays directly against our incredible human arrogance, of course. But once again, we have to be real and we have to be honest. And we have to look at ourselves for what we really are, for who we really are. Remember, nature tinkers. Little by little, immense spans of time, all the changes take place. We must abandon our human arrogance. We simply have to do that. We have to take a more honest look at who we are. Well, if we do that, how would that play? If we do that, should we see traits that we have always, not always, but for a long time, considered to be strictly human traits? Should we see some of those as maybe not strictly human, maybe shared by all kinds of other animals? Is that possible? Well, remember Aquinas' definition of love. Willing the good of the other. Willing the good of the other. Even Webster, the assurance of affection. Can we see any of that in any of the other animals, creatures about us? Any reflections of that in other, for instance, highly evolved animals? Let me tell you a story about an elephant. This was noticed by a gamekeeper in Africa who, in fact, was taking care of the elephants and watching out for them and keeping track of them. At one point, he came upon a cow elephant who had lost her calf. The calf was lying nearby. It was dead. Whether it had been disease or accident or predator, whatever, the person did not know. But this big cow elephant was standing there over her calf, rocking back and forth with deep moans, moaning. Another elephant, interesting to note, another cow elephant, another female elephant, came up next to her, leaned up next to her, put her trunk over her shoulders, and the two of them stood and rocked back and forth together and moaned, deep, sorrowful moans. Willing the good of the others, assurance of affection, great empathy, consolation? Are we looking at foundations of love? Let me tell you another story. This was about chimpanzees. I know a scientist, studied animal cognition, spent a lot of time working with chimpanzees, in fact. She told me the story that she was working in a particular establishment that housed chimpanzees, took very good care of them. But there was one chimp, a very large male, 200 pounds, named Daryl. He was kept in a cage separate, in a room separate from the rest of the colony because he was incredibly violent. Incredibly violent. Horrible. She said if you would come into the room to, for instance, feed him or whatever, he would scream, yell, throw things at you, including feces, throwing at you. She said he could take a mouthful of water and spit and hit you right between the eyes with it, screaming and yelling. He'd jump up on his cage and grab you and shake and shake and shake. Oh. The cage itself was made up of small squares, okay, little metal squares, like a big fence, very, very heavy duty, of course. She said to feed this critter, people would come in and feed, and they would be covered with filth by the time they were done, and they would have to go somewhere and change into a new outfit. And in order to feed him, you would have to come to a door that you would pull down, put the food in that, and then close the door, and the food would drop down onto his eating platform. Well, she said the problem with that is when you would go to, you'd open it up quickly, put the food there, and as you were closing it, you try to do that as quickly as you could because it was possible for him to put his hand up and through and grab you by the wrist. She said if he ever got a hold of your wrist, you were doomed because they were immensely strong, and it could have broken the arm, torn the hand even right off the arm. So you had to be very, very careful. She said one time this almost happened to her. She was very careful, put the food in, went to close it immediately, and he was so fast, he reached up and almost got her arm before she was able to pull it away. A beast. Well, she thought, I wonder if it has to be this way. I wonder what would happen if instead of our regular interactions with this big guy, 200 pounds, screaming and yelling, throwing things at you, what would happen if I tried something different? So, what she did, end of the day, she went in and brought a little stool with her, put it down next to the cage, far enough away that he wasn't able to get a hold of her or anything, and just sat there. Maybe read a book. Just sat. Meanwhile, on the other side over here, he is screaming and yelling. He's throwing things. He's jumping up and down. He jumps up on the cage and shakes it and screaming and yelling and screaming and yelling. And she just sat there for a long time. A long time. Until finally, Daryl decided she's not going to go anywhere. She's going to stay here. What do I do? So she said he actually came up next to the cage enclosure and put his fingers through the mesh. She could reach over and just ran her finger along his fingers. And he began to settle down. And he stopped. And she said she stood up and she looked at him and said, "Are you going to be a good boy?" And he went. He could understand her. These animals are incredibly intelligent. In their own ways, they're incredibly intelligent. Somebody had asked, she said, somebody was working with her one time and asked, they're not very smart, are they? And she said, "Are you kidding? They're as smart as they need to be," which is very smart. So then she stood up and she looked at him and she said, "Are you going to be a good boy?" And he said, "Yes." And she said to him, she just kind of came to her, said, "Would you like a kiss?" And he backed up and said, "Yes." So he came over to the cage, the little bars, and put his lips through the cage. And she came over and kissed him on the lips. She said from that moment on, he became the poster child for good chimpanzee behavior. From that moment on, he was a whole new creature. He could be let out into the colony as long as each morning, to start the day, she would come in and give him a kiss. It didn't work so well with some of the other people who had to come in and feed him. He was still screaming, yelling, throw things, and all the rest. Not for her. For her, she would give him a kiss in the morning, and he was a perfect chimpanzee. What happened? What happened here? Affection? As long as he could be assured of her affection, everything was okay. He had no reason to be afraid any longer. Willing the good of the other. I think that is a most remarkable story. Is this, in fact, the advent of the idea of love across the board? Elephants with such compassion and empathy. A chimpanzee who is willing to change his entire attitude. There's a principle in evolution called convergent evolution, which means that one factor that will show up here will show up in other places as well, maybe even in things that are unrelated. For instance, we think of convergent evolution in terms of wings, for instance. Well, we know birds have wings, of course. So do bats. Oh, not only avians, but mammals also. Really? Absolutely so. Convergent evolution can take place, as science shows us, in many, many ways we would never even think of. We have two eyes. So do all kinds of other critters. Where'd that come from? Convergent evolution. Well, it turned out to be a good adaptation. And it was borrowed by all kinds of different species, different kinds of animals, whatnot, across the board. So this reality refers, of course, to physical convergent evolution. How about psychological evolution? I wonder if that's possible. Adaptations in the whole evolutionary process. Because remember, once again, an adaptation is going to take advantage of some specific area. Some little change will make a difference. I wonder if our notion of love couldn't fit into that very thing, for us and for others. Darrell the chimp, the elephant. Remember Karl Rahner, do not underestimate what it means for nature to become. So what would be the advantage of love in the evolutionary process? Take that as one of your note questions for our gathering when we get together on our Zoom conference on Sunday. Think about that. What would be the advantage of being able to love and be loved? Wow. We've seen a lot of things today. We started off way back there with my science costume on, talking about the very beginnings of everything. And the beginning of everything in the evolutionary process that would eventually lead to us, you and me, right here. Amazing. Do you suppose that if we really appreciated all of this, we would see the magnificence of both the creative experience at the beginning of all of this in the Big Bang, along with that constant, continuous maintaining of all that is. Remember last time? You are the song of the divine. We are all the songs of the divine. Everything that exists, part of the song of the divine. Wow. Can we talked about this last time, can we possibly enter into the imagination of God? Can we do that? Can we try to step into the imagination of God? We are simply a part of the immense web of life, existence that spans across time and the universe. And we are all intricate members of that reality. How unbelievably fortunate we are. Unbelievably fortunate we are. For instance, think of your own existence. Let's go back to the very beginnings of your own existence. Sometimes we get a little bit hesitant to talk about things, but what if, for instance, what if that second sperm would have gotten there before the one that actually penetrated the ovum that would lead to you? If that other guy would have gotten there first, we wouldn't be having this conversation. One of us would not exist as we are today. It would be an entirely different human being. Maybe a different gender. But here we are. Here we are. Not only in our origins, but in the continuation of our lives as we go along. Maybe, as a dear old friend of mine told me one time, his sole prayer at this time in his life is thank you, thank you, thank you. Can I say that one more time? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Because of all of this, do we, Homo sapiens, individuals, right here and now, do we owe an obligation to everything and everyone else who exists along with us at this time? Should we, in fact, have an obligation in there to take care of one another? Let me read for you something that was written about Margaret Mead, a wonderful, wonderful woman, great anthropologist. A student, let me read this to you. A student asked one time what Mead considered to be the first sign of civilization in any culture. The student expected Mead to talk about fish hooks, clay pots, sharpened stones for knives and things. But no. Margaret Mead said that the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur bone, a thigh bone, that had been broken and then healed. Mead explained that in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You cannot run from danger. You cannot get to the river for drink. You cannot hunt for food. You are meat for the prowling beasts. Meat for the prowling beasts. Does this remind you of first letter of St. Peter? The devil, as a roaring lion, goes about seeking someone to devour. You are meat for the prowling beasts. No animal survives a broken leg long enough for that bone to heal. A broken femur that has healed is evidence that someone has taken time to stay with the one who fell, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended the person through recovery, which can be an extended period of time. Helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization begins, Mead said. We are at our best when we serve others. We are at our best when we serve others. Is this St. Francis of Assisi talking about Brother Sun and Sister Moon, about our relationship with the other animals, the other beasts of this world? Isn't this what Jesus was talking about when he was talking about look out for the other guy? Look out for the other guy. And in fact, in our next conversation, we're going to take a look at what the early Christian experience would indicate about this very question. We will talk about Jesus. We will talk about the Blessed Mother. We will talk about St. Paul and the other early followers and how they saw the idea, the reality, the notion of love. I think you'll find it very interesting. And this will be the beginning of our Christian spiritual experience as we discuss the notions of love. So, some notes and quotes. For our conversation on Sunday, consider this. What do you think about all of this? Everything we've talked about today? What do you think about it? Does any of it make you uncomfortable? Does any of it delight you? Why would that be? And remember my musings based on C.S. Lewis's piece. These are things that I think about. These are things that interest me. What interests you? What interests you? What plays in your heart? And what about that prayer? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Think about these things. Maybe take some notes, write some things down. I'll look forward to talking to you on Sunday. And remember, I promised you some quotes. Oh my gosh, I forgot in the second session to give you the quotes at the end. I'm very sorry about that. Remember, these quotes are from children 4 to 8 years old. Ask the question of what does love mean? And remember the first ones that we talked about, for instance, when someone loves you the way they say your name is different, you just know that your name is safe in their mouth. Here are two more. Here is Carl, age 5. Love is when you go out to eat and you give somebody most of your French fries without making them give you any of theirs. Well, of course. Willing the good of the other. Or here's Billy, age 4. Love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other. I'm sorry. That one really got me. And they go out and smell each other. Maybe so. Thank you for being with us today. Again, my prayer always for you is, as Rebecca said, may your name always be safe in the mouths of those who love you, and vice versa. Blessings always.